everybody. My name is Avril Keating and I am the Director of the Centre for Global Youth here at UCL. Well, here am I coming from my living room, but generally I work for University College London. I want to welcome you today to a new series that we are starting and that we're calling CGY Conversations With. The reason we're doing this is because we want to try to find a way to maintain research dialogue at a time when for obvious reasons our usual face-to-face seminars aren't really possible. We could have tried to run our seminars in the usual way, trying to do some webinars online and that sort of thing, but we wanted to try to do something that was a little bit more informal and a little bit more relaxed. And so that's why, instead of asking people to do formal presentations, what we're instead going to do is just have chats with people, have little conversations, and to ask people about their current research as it relates to young people around the world. I'm absolutely delighted that today our first conversation is going to be with Dr. Sazana Jayadeva. Sazana is a postdoctoral research fellow on the Euro Students project, which is led by Professor Rachel Brooks and is based at the University of Surrey. Sazana has also previously been a colleague of mine at UCL, and so we will miss you. Prior to joining Euro Students, Sazana was also a fellow at the Giga Institute of Global and Area Studies in Hamburg in Germany. And today we're going to learn more about Sazana's research. So thank you so much for joining us today, Sazana. It's just
my pleasure entirely.
Okay, so to start off, tell us about your research. What have you been up to?
Okay, so I recently completed a small study about the impact of COVID-19 on international student mobility from India to Germany. So I did fieldwork for that project between March and June. And, you know, the situation is so rapidly evolving that I can really just say that I did a study of a period of time in this entire era of pandemic.
Good point.
Okay. Yeah, so I guess the goal of the study was to understand how the pandemic was impacting and reshaping prospective international students' plans to come to Germany for study, and also how it was affecting Indians who were currently studying in Germany.
Okay. And what impact was it going to have? Did you find in between March and June?
Yeah. So I think one of the most striking things was that given that COVID-19 is first and foremost a health crisis, the health and safety concerns were not very high. So people weren't really concerned about moving to another country in the middle of a pandemic, and they weren't really scared about living in Germany while this pandemic was going on. And this was even in March, when the situation in India wasn't very bad, but Germany at that point was, I think, the second worst hit country in Europe after Italy. So there was a feeling that the German government was still in control. They were handling the pandemic very well. And also there was a feeling that international students were being very well supported.
Okay. And what were then? So health and safety, that was a big issue.
That was really not that was not a huge concern. But what was the biggest concern was really job market related issues. Okay. So for a lot of the people, so maybe I should quickly tell you about who I interviewed and what my fieldwork was.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. So I had earlier in 2017-18 done a study about Indian students and why Germany has become such a popular study destination. And so at that point, I had done interviews with 40 Indians who were interested in going to Germany for study. And so now, between March and June, I did follow-up chats with 15 of them. And then some of them put me in touch with friends of theirs who they were currently hanging out with, saying, I think this person would also be interested in speaking with you. And so I had about 15 to 20 people in total that I spoke with. And I wasn't really, I was quite cautious about not wanting to put even more strain on them at what was possibly quite a stressful time. And so I didn't want to do formal interviews. But the good thing was that I had kind of been in off and on contact with all of these people anyway. And so we had really informal chats on WhatsApp video, Facebook, and so it was more catching up. So I had these follow-up chats. You were saying, did you want to say
So
something?
it was less of sort of like, here is your interview slot. You just
Yeah.
sort of like little periods over different formats. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, because I was just, I didn't want to put them under further stress because I was already aware from some of our informal chats that many of them were in difficult positions. For example, some had gone to India for a holiday and then the Indian lockdown, the German borders had closed and they weren't able to come back. And there were people who had lost their internships and were in various difficult situations. So I had these informal conversations with about 15 to 20 people. And the other thing I did both during the first phase of the project and the second phase during the pandemic was digital ethnographic research in Facebook and WhatsApp groups. So just to give you a little bit of background so people know what I'm talking about, one of the interesting findings of the project in the previous phase was that a lot of Indians who are interested in going to Germany for study use Facebook and WhatsApp groups as kind of mutual support communities where they actively collaborate and support each other through the nitty-gritty of the application process, and also with kind of discussing broader strategies in the sense of where should I apply, what course is best for me to do, how do I, when should I be applying, these broader questions also. And so these Facebook and WhatsApp groups, they're really fascinating because they bring together people from across the country. So people who, most of whom have never met each other in real life. So you have people from big cities, villages, towns, all kind of collaborating and supporting each other through the application process. So in the previous phase of the study, what I did was I got permission from group administrators and I entered these groups and did a digital ethnography. So I was just kind of sitting in these groups as if they were rooms and observing the conversation that was happening. And the conversation, particularly in the WhatsApp groups, was intense. There was just a constant exchange. So it was really like very intensive fieldwork. And I would just be taking notes. And sometimes people would contact me privately because they saw that at that time I had a German number. And on WhatsApp, you can see +49. They would ask me if I could give them some advice about German universities. And I would take these opportunities to also clarify who I was. And but I did end up chatting with some of these people, which was really interesting. So now when the pandemic unfolded, I thought that these groups were again a very valuable space in which one could get quite a hands-on sense of the on-the-ground realities, like what are the struggles that people are having, how are they thinking about studying abroad at a time like this, what kind of disruptions are affecting this process of going abroad to study. So I rejoined I think 4 or 5 WhatsApp groups. And I once again began to do this digital ethnographic research. So that was the two methods, these follow-up interviews and this digital ethnographic research.
So was COVID then a big theme in these digital spaces?
Yeah. So in fact, initially I was really surprised because when I entered them, I imagined that it would all be COVID, but it felt really in some ways quite business as usual. And there were absolutely no health-related concerns, as I already said. What was really probably the biggest concern was job market related. So a majority of the people that I interviewed and interacted with, both during the first phase of the project and during the second phase, for them, an important goal of doing a master's degree in Germany was getting work experience in their field of study after graduation. So this was an important goal. Of course, they also valued, the possibility of getting an international education and having an international adventure, meeting people from different countries, being in these world-class facilities. All of this was valued, but a very important objective was getting this relevant work experience in their field of study. And so a big concern in the interviews I did and the groups, the conversations that I witnessed in the groups was about the job market. So there was concerns that with a recession, would the job market be very impacted at the time that they graduated? Some of the people that I interviewed in 2017-18 were now in very advanced stages of their degrees, and some had already graduated. And so among the people who had graduated, they were faced with a really horrible job market. So some of them had already applied for jobs, and they got responses saying that we're not hiring anyone at the moment, your application is on hold. Similarly, those who were in the advanced stages of the degree, like third year or fourth year, and who should have been doing internships and master's thesis placements, were really struggling to get these. And this was, again, a huge concern, because these internships and work placements were seen as really crucial for getting jobs later on. So there was, I was told repeatedly that by students who were in the final years of their degrees, that people in the years ahead of them had said that, you have a lot of people get a job at the same place where they had a work placement. So it's really important you get a good work placement. And also there was a feeling that the social networks you cultivate while you're doing a work placement will really help you get further employment. So there was a lot of concern around, first of all, whether there would be good jobs when they graduated, but also whether they would be able to get these important stepping stone opportunities. Some of the people were lucky, and they actually did have internships and work placements, but because of social distancing requirements, they were not really going into work, which was, again, very disappointing, because the whole joy had been this, idea of being in a German company, being a part of a team, building those networks, and they felt kind of shortchanged. So that was the biggest concern. And even among those who were in India and planning to apply, this was the main topic of conversation. So, how is the job market going to be? We're going to graduate only in 3 years. Is it going to be better then? And they were also hearing a lot from people in the years ahead of them through social media.
Okay, so I wonder if this related to the fact that COVID-19, certainly during the initial stages, was presented more as an employment risk for young people and a study risk, not a health risk. It's like, well, if you got COVID and you're a young person, you'll be absolutely fine. You don't need to worry about that.
That's
so
probably,
that may have factored into their thinking. Possibly, or the risks of not being employed in India, are they much higher
now
in terms for this particular cohort of young people? Because what kind of student from India tends to go to Germany?
That's a really good question. So 70% of the Indians who are studying in Germany are doing an engineering postgraduate degree. And what was really interesting when I did the interviews earlier was that I found, obviously when I started preparing for this project, I had anticipated that there were many important pull factors. So things like the fact that Germany has really affordable education, even for international students. So most universities are free. You just have a small semester contribution. And there are universities in some parts of the country that charge very moderate fees, like €1,000, which is a fraction of what you would have to pay in the UK or US, for example. So I was aware that the affordable education was a big draw. And I say affordable, but I think it's still important to remember that most people who come to Germany still take loans to cover their living expenses. So it's not free education, but it's certainly a financial investment that a much larger demographic are able to make. So I was aware that affordable education was an important pull factor. And also over the last 5 to 10 years, Germany has been offering an increasing number of courses in English. So these were some obvious reasons why one would imagine that Indians would come to Germany. But what was very interesting when I started doing the interviews was that I realized that almost, maybe not as important, but very important as well, was the feeling of the Indian job market for engineers being really bad. So this was a huge reason for which people were leaving the country. So what I was told was that, engineering degrees in India have for decades now been seen as the kind of preferred degree you do if you're a smart child. Even when I was doing interviews with Indian students in Germany, and they would ask me, so what do you study? And I would say social anthropology. And they would say, oh, wow. So did you do that after engineering? Kind of just assuming that there must have been an engineering somewhere. And when I was growing up as well, you would keep hearing parents say, you can do whatever you want, but you first do an engineering degree so you have options. So for certain sections of the middle class, this engineering degree had been a very important strategy of, social mobility. But the problem that a lot of my interlocutors brought up again and again was that when you graduate from an engineering college, there just aren't enough jobs, particularly if you're not in the field of computer science. Because with India's IT boom, there are a lot of opportunities for computer scientists, and computer science companies. They're called mass recruiters. So they'll come into a university and they'll recruit just 1,000 people, and they don't really care if you're not a software engineer. If you're a chemical engineer, mechanical engineer, we'll retrain you. We retrain everyone anyway. So if you are a software engineer, it was relatively easier to get a job. But if your specialization was, mechanical or chemical engineering, a lot of students really struggled to get jobs that were matching their educational qualifications and training. I was told that if you were at the most elite and prestigious universities in India, it was quite easy. So if you were like at the IITs or even the next tier of engineering institutions, it was not too tough. A lot of companies would be interested in hiring you. But if you were at one of the many less elite universities, which the majority of students attend, it was really hard to get a job that matched your training. And so many of the people that I interviewed and the people that I spoke with in the social media groups were had all been or were currently in very difficult situations. So many of them were unemployed after doing this really successful degree, and on paper very successful, but just not able to get a job. Some people who were passionate about mechanical and chemical engineering had been forced to retrain as software engineers and had been working as software engineers for some years now. There were also people who were attempting these extremely competitive exams to get entry into very prestigious universities for a master's level program. And the hope was not that they didn't really want to do a master's, but the hope was that if they got a degree from a better branded college, then they might be able to get a job. And so they were in all these difficult situations and kind of prolonged periods of stagnation. And in this context, suddenly the possibility of study in Germany was seen as a very accessible, affordable option to kind of be able to do the kind of work that they wanted to do to stay in their fields and get back on track.
But also possibly an escape from family disappointment of why haven't you got a socially mobile job yet? Did that ever play a factor?
So I think that what was interesting was in many cases, parents were so students did speak about how their parents were very keen that they get a job, and sometimes were kind of putting pressure on them to accept a job in software engineering, for example, even if they were a mechanical engineer, saying you can't just spend a year preparing for exams, so maybe you should just take something. So there was a feeling that there was pressure from parents, but also maybe just as much a kind of societal pressure that at a certain age, you need to stop studying and you need to be working. And so why is this person not working yet, and in some cases it wasn't really the parents, but it was this general feeling of pressure that I need to be moving to the next stage of life.
I need to be making the transition to adulthood. Can I ask, in India, what is the so-called acceptable age at which you have to stop studying and move on now?
Well, that's a really
difficult...
For
men, I imagine it's different for men and women.
Probably. I think that's a difficult question, but maybe a good way to answer that was that when I would do interviews with some people in Germany who were, I don't know, maybe like mid-20s, some of them wanted to explain to me that it was not abnormal in Germany to be this old and still studying, because maybe they felt that in India, by your early 20s, you should be done studying. Maybe I think doing an MBA a bit later was still okay, but a lot of people feel that you need to finish one degree after the other, and then the work starts. And so some people who had spent, I don't know, 4 years working in a software company and then were going back to studying a master's in, I don't know, mechanical or chemical engineering, felt somehow that they were doing something a bit unconventional. And maybe that's why I felt the need to explain to me, given that I was Indian, that, you know, it's a bit weird that I'm studying now, but I felt that it's important that I get back into the discipline that I'm passionate about. And in Germany, people do this all the time. There's a 30-year-old kid in my class, you know, so
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 old,
old.
30. So how did you end up studying this? Why did you start researching this topic?
You mean
From student mobility to Germany?
Okay. I think what I was interested in, so I after my PhD which was about, well, very broadly speaking, the relationship between education and class in contemporary India, I became interested in looking at student mobility. And around that time, I was noticing that there were all these new study destinations coming up. So I had done a small pilot study at education consultancies after my PhD, just to kind of scope it. And I noticed that suddenly consultants were telling people about study in Latvia and Lithuania, Estonia, Poland. And these were not places that had been on the map when I was living in India. And so that was kind of striking to me. And I thought, wow, there are all these new places, and are these new places creating new patterns of student mobility? Or are the people who go to these places just people who would have otherwise gone to traditional destinations like the US and the UK and Australia? And so I think that was my interest, to kind of look at some new destinations. And then, as it often is with academic projects, I think often your project ends up being slightly impacted by the funding source that you're applying for. So I was applying for a German funding source, and I thought, okay, well, it makes sense to focus this on Germany, because Germany was becoming increasingly popular. So in the last 5 years, the number of Indians going to Germany has tripled. And so it's really huge increase in popularity. So I thought, well, that fits nicely into this broader project about new patterns of mobility. And I also noticed while I was doing the proposal that most people who go to Germany are engineers. So I thought, well, that's interesting too. And so that could be interesting to explore that further. And the social media stuff was not in my proposal at all. It was not something I even imagined existed. And I wonder if I had created a proposal that was all about this social media research. I even wonder if I would have been rejected, because I didn't have any track record of being a digital ethnographer, you know. But I kind of stumbled upon these groups very early in the project. I think in the first month, I was just trying to figure out ways to meet Indian students. And I joined a few of these groups. And then I very quickly realized that, wow, there's something that I could never have imagined that's happening here. And maybe the project should be about this. So that's how it happened.
I love the way research sometimes is actually just sheer luck and coincidence, and that it can take you off on a completely different track.
Yeah.
Thank God
and I
for
was
that.
really lucky. I was really lucky that the funders were just amazing, the DAAD, and they were just very flexible, and they have been really supportive and also really interested in my research. So they keep inviting me back to present findings from the project. And I think that's also been a really great experience, to be in dialogue with practitioners and people at the policy level.
Okay. So why do you think that student mobility is something that's such an important issue for us to look at right now?
I mean, obviously, it's becoming, particularly from, I'm going to respond with respect to India. there's just an increasing number of people who are going abroad to study. And what I'm personally interested in is how it's becoming a more accessible option for an increasing number of people. So you see, even with Germany, it's just made study abroad accessible to so many people who would have never been able to dream of it. So a common theme that came up in the interviews I did was that people would say, so I did these interviews 17, 18, when there was still just people were beginning to become aware about this place, the fact that Germany offers courses in English and it's very affordable. And so a lot of people in the interviews would say, I had never thought that I would go abroad to study. I had never seen it as part of my plan or a possibility for me because it's so expensive. And that was not even something I was thinking about. And then when I was in this position of being stuck, I thought, why not? And also in the social media groups, I've had amazing conversations with people who are from small villages where nobody in that village has ever gone abroad. And through these social media groups, these people can suddenly imagine and they can see themselves going abroad because they see other people who are not from the IITs, but just from normal universities in small towns and villages who are also going abroad. And I think that it's just a much larger number of people who are beginning to imagine this possibility of going abroad. And I think that's something that's really important to capture.
So from my own perspective, I would be interested, because of my research background, in relation to kind of the capacity for developing global citizenship or political engagement, or your relationships through sort of your civic ties. But for you, is it that you're more interested in the impact of the student mobility on social mobility?
Yeah, so I am interested on the impact on, so I'm also interested in education to job transitions. That's something I want to start working on more. And also, yeah, what kind of larger class projects and strategies of mobility is studying abroad a part of. And the other thing that I'm getting increasingly interested in is also the role that social media platforms play. So in the previous study, I've really focused on the Facebook and WhatsApp groups, but there's also other platforms, for example, YouTube. So there are a small number of YouTubers who are Indians who are currently studying in Germany or who have recently graduated from a German university. And they have YouTube channels where they present information to people who are in India who want to come abroad. So they kind of talk them through what kind of universities there are. They even take them on tours with their cameras of a campus, show them what a class looks like, teach them how to use public transport. And I feel that these YouTubers are really becoming very important study abroad influencers. And I'm developing a project that will hopefully someday be funded to explore how these YouTubers work and the kind of impact they have on students' mobility strategies. And also another fascinating thing is that as these YouTubers get older and as they move through their own journeys, their content also reflects that. So when I started the project, the YouTubers were all mainly trying to help people in India come to Germany. But now I see that more and more of them are also making content on how to move towards employment. And so how to get the right internship. And all of this there's so much unwritten stuff there, just like with academia, I guess. You really need to know how to play the game. And unless you are initiated into it by people who know how to do this, you could be lost. And I feel these YouTubers are really unpacking, how do you write to a company and ask that you want an internship? You shouldn't be overly formal. You need to strike the right balance, and all of these unwritten rules, just really making it, demystifying it for their audiences, which now are not just people in India, but also people who have come through them to Germany and are now moving through their course and hoping to get a job. So it's really fascinating.
Fascinating is that they're not just sort of educating them through the sort of education transition, so into Germany, or in the school or in the education to work transition, but also actually in a cultural transition, in the sense of helping you decode.
Yeah,
this is how you write in Germany, and this is how you write. This is how you write to an employer in England or the United States, and that's quite an important bridge. And I'm slightly curious, who taught the influencers? Who
I
gave
think
them
they just
the passwords?
I think they just through trying and failing and learning, often they'll tell you something like, this is how I did it the first time, and now when I look at it I just cringe. But now I've learned through this feedback. And they also bring other people on the channel, so uh, they might have a video where they say, okay, I'm going to introduce you to Indians who are working at Bosch or who are working at Daimler. And so you can speak with them directly and ask them your questions.
I wonder, is there also a specific Indian element to this, in the sense that are other national groups or ethnicities as supportive of one another as Indian students seem to be? Are there other examples of countries that are doing this?
That's a really good question. I was also looking constantly. I feel like I would love at some point to do a comparative study with China, because I'm absolutely sure there must be these kind of networks. And I've heard informally that they are, but obviously these are different social media channels, different language, so quite inaccessible to me at the moment. But what was very interesting for me was that in these Indian groups, initially they were just Indians, but then as time went on, I started to notice that there were lots of people from other South Asian countries, some African countries, South American countries joining these groups. And sometimes people would even be quite surprised. And there was this one conversation that I witnessed where someone asked a person from Brazil, isn't there any group for Brazilians? Why are you here? And the Brazilian person said, no, actually, I couldn't find a group with enough people. And so I feel like there needs to be this critical mass for the group to work, because you need a certain number of really active people. And these Indian groups exist and they have that critical mass. And so maybe somebody from, I don't know, Iraq or Iran might not be able to have already this infrastructure, and it's just easier to join. And most of these groups anyway, the Indian groups, all conversation happens largely in English because we have so many different languages. So in that sense, it's possible for people from other countries to join. And so you do see a lot of global South countries in these Indian groups. And I think for me also, what it shows is that it's certain countries who feel a certain gap in the kind of migration infrastructure that they're able to access. And these groups really fill that gap for them. Whereas somebody in the US wouldn't enter this kind of group, because I think they have other kinds of support, even in their schools and their universities, where they would get this guidance.
You need to put a shout out on social media to see if anyone can collaborate with you from China.
That's a really good idea. Yeah, I
Only
keep asking people. Huh?
If only we had all the money in the world to be able to research all of these things. It'd be so nice. So nice.
So nice.
Okay, so I want to move on and ask you a question about you. So you've written up some of the findings from this fieldwork that you did between March and June in a paper, which is called The Impact of COVID-19 on Postgraduate Level Student Migration from India to Germany. And I'll post a link later.
Thank you.
And from my perspective, it told me an awful lot about the impact of COVID-19 on the pull factors and why young people still wanted to go to Germany. But it didn't tell me an awful lot if there were any additional push factors from India. So did you notice they were talking about, like, I have to get out of India, this is, going to be an employment disaster, or any of those sorts of things?
I think that this was always a conversation that was happening even before COVID. So already there was this feeling of being stuck and not being able to get good jobs in your field. And and I just want to make it clear, because I think these kind of things can sometimes be misinterpreted. It wasn't that they wanted to flee India to get a job abroad, but really all of the people that I interviewed were really passionate about their work. They said, I always wanted to be a mechanical engineer. I'm passionate about chemical engineering. I just want to work in this field, and I'm not able to do this in India. So I think that was always a big push factor. And the way that the impact that COVID has had is mainly amplifying that. So if the job market was bad earlier, it is just much worse now. And so it's just amplified an existing push factor, I would say. I didn't feel like people were saying that I have to get out of India now because of non-job related COVID reasons.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, but certainly they felt that the employment risks were
Yeah,
even higher.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think also some
And
people were even afraid to resign from jobs that they were unhappy in. That was something that had changed. So earlier,
mhm,
people who were applying to German universities were quite relieved to resign and move on. But now there's a lot of anxiety because although as I didn't have much time to discuss it now, but you'll see it in the paper that I say that a lot of Indian students, despite being quite anxious about job prospects, they're still interested in going to Germany for study. But there's so many logistical problems because of COVID-related disruptions. So visa offices
mhm,
are closed and they open, and it's just these logistical problems are making people very anxious about about whether they'll actually be able to go. So
mhm,
yeah, so some of them are not resigning from jobs and kind of playing it safe and waiting to see what will happen. But yeah,
mhm.
um,
Okay, so a lot of institutional and bureaucratic hurdles being
yeah, and
the
I
main
think also
issue.
the universities are adapting and they're also learning in real time. So initially, some of the German universities they still required people to send hard copies of applications, and in India there were just no courier services, and you couldn't get your transcripts from the university. So that was a big drama. And then also sometimes some universities had a requirement that you could only begin your course online if you had a visa stamp in your passport. And a lot
Mhm,
of people didn't. And so I think universities are also constantly having to adjust their application requirements and their entire admission procedures as the situation keeps evolving.
mhm. We're all having to be very adept and very flexible as we try to
Yeah,
cope with the current context.
yeah.
Um, so, thinking about then, um, the future and what's next for you and what's next for this research area. What do you think are going to be the most important youth issues that we should be researching next?
Well, for me in particular, I think immediately the next thing I would like to do is this YouTube project and also to
Mm-hmm.
look at education to work transitions. But I think in a more broad sense, I think that some topics that are really, really important to study as soon as possible are, for example, in India, I mean, there's so many, but just to give you a few examples. And these are also kind of impacted by my own research interests, of course. One is, I think that um, educational strategies for people of all ages, right from school to university in India now, I think are being hugely impacted by COVID and related disruptions. So my doctoral
Mm-hmm.
research was about, among other things, about English medium schooling. So and how a lot of parents are opting out of the government-run schools. The majority, I think, 85% of students, school-going students at the time of my fieldwork, were attending private institutions. And one of the most
Wow.
important reasons was that these institutions taught in English. And English was seen as a really important, English proficiency was seen as a really important skill for social mobility. And I feel now from the things that I'm reading and also anecdotally from what I'm hearing, a lot of people are withdrawing their children from English medium schools and are having to put them in government schools or make very difficult decisions about changing the strategies for some children, usually the girls. And so I think it's quite important to study the impact of economic recession and various job-related disruptions now on parents' educational strategies for their children, and also with young adults, their kind of transitions into the job market, because it's a really, really difficult and a scary time in India right now. And I think that that's something that urgently needs to be researched and documented. The other
Mm-hmm.
thing that I think is really would be a really fascinating and important study are youth political movements in India. A lot of people are, for the first time, have become involved in the last few years in political movements, and I think there's so much to be studied there as well. So,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like these are some of the...
Well, hopefully we'll get a chance to study some of those topics, because they sound absolutely fascinating. Yeah, and especially if there's not much already existing in that area, we hope that we can build up some youth capacity and research in that.
And I think also now more than ever, we need to think about strategies of research that will directly benefit and not inconvenience the people we're studying. More than ever, I think there's this constant feeling that I have, that how do we immediately have some kind, because dissemination and academic impact and even policy briefs can help only so much. So I think it's
you're being really kind there. I think so much is overstating the impact of the policy brief. It depends on your research. It does depend.
It depends on the research,
But sometimes I think what you should hold on to, and certainly when I've done quite a lot of interviews with young people, is that sometimes they just want to be heard. They want someone to listen to their story.
That's true.
So that can be an immediate impact. And if they don't want to, they just give you yes/no answers, and then you haven't inconvenienced them that much, because they're not really all that interested in engaging. Of course, sometimes it's that we have gone about it in the wrong way. So I'm trying to find new and different methods to get beyond the yes/no answers. But now, see, my fieldwork has been suspended for a year because I was hoping to do fieldwork in classrooms with young people around their mobility aspirations, actually, and whether they were planning on moving. And so that's not going to be an option. So how do I find different ways in order to do this virtually, and how, as an old person, to get them to engage using social media platforms or to use these sorts of things, not least because there's an assumption which I have fallen to in the past, which is that, if we make it digital, well, the students will come and, then they'll just love this and they'll all participate.
No.
Unless it's organic and makes sense to them, it's definitely not going to work. So I think there's a lot of thinking in the field that still needs to be done on how we do effective research with young people and how we make the most out of that.
That's true.
Okay. But for the moment, I'm going to say we're going to pause our conversation here. There's still lots more to talk about, but we'll do that at another time. Thank you so much for coming along today and talking to me. It's just been such a joy to listen